Hi. In the previous episode of this series, we've talked about Rasa forms, and we've seen how Rasa forms can be used to retrieve information from the user such that this information can be stored as slots to be used later in the conversation for a custom action. You might also remember a diagram like the one that you see here. In the base example, we discussed how you can order a pizza and that we might have a form in which we need to know the size of the pizza and the kind of pizza that you're interested in. So that means that if a user were to say, I want a veggie pizza, we can detect that veggie is a pizza type, which the form can then use to fill a slot with, and we can follow up by asking about the size of the pizza. The form would automate this, and we would keep asking questions until the form is filled in, after which we typically have a custom action ready to follow up. Now, the diagram that you see here, it shows what might happen when the user answers the questions perfectly, without any hiccups whatsoever. And you could say that what we're looking at here is a happy path. Now, the term happy path is a term from software development, and that usually refers to situations where the user is behaving as expected. A situation where the user is not behaving as expected is therefore also often described as an unhappy path. Now, unhappy paths shouldn't be seen as a bad thing. Just because a user isn't doing what was expected doesn't mean that what they're doing is not valid. Keeping that in mind now, though, if we now look back at the diagram demonstrates a great starting point, but it's only just a starting point. Very typically, we really want to customize the form such that we can account for some of the common unhappy paths that might occur. We've seen before that we can use validators to make sure that the user provides correct information, but we also need to keep in mind conversations when the user changes topics, interrupts, or maybe even asks to cancel the form. So in this video, we're going to be diving deeper into forms by exploring different ways to customize them. We'll discuss how to deal with unhappy paths in forms, and we'll also explore how to make forms a bit more dynamic. So let's start by zooming in on a very common cause of unhappy paths, namely the interruption. Let's now consider this diagram. What we see here is that a user is interested in buying a pizza, and when the form is active and when the form is asking the user about information, the user might actually stop and wonder and think, hey, am I talking to a human or am I talking to a bot? So that means that while the form is active, the user is actually interrupting a little bit here, because the user is asking something that doesn't have anything to do with the form. So this is a clear example of an interruption. Instead of what we expect, the user might interrupt with a chit-chat kind of a question. In this case, are you a bot? And in these situations, we like to answer the question perfectly, but afterwards we really want to return back to the form. The idea here is that we still use a rule to handle the chit-chat, but when the chit-chat has been dealt with, we immediately go back to the form. This way, the interruption will only temporarily stop the form loop, and the goal here is that once the interruption is taken care of, we can pick up the form conversation again. Now, in Rasa, the way that you can accomplish this is by effectively just configuring an extra rule. Here's what such a rule might look like. The main thing to point out here is that we see that there's an active loop, and that there is an intent called bot challenge around, and that it's followed up by an action that answers the question appropriately. Once that's been dealt with, we basically just say that the loop is still active and proceed from there. This rule can really be specified with a condition, because it basically says if the simple pizza loop is active, then answer bot challenge with utter I am a bot before going back to the loop. Let's give a quick demo of what this might look like. What you're looking at here is an instance of Visual Studio Code with a Rasa project loaded. It is the project that we made in the previous video, and the change that I've made is I've added this one extra rule. This is the rule that is going to handle interruptions of intent bot challenge. If the simple pizza form is active and we spot the bot challenge intent, then this rule makes sure that we reply appropriately by uttering this response. Note that when this is done, we immediately go back to the form. That way we can say that once this interruption has been dealt with, we recover, so to say. What I'm going to do now is give a small demo that this works, but before I can do that, I first need to make sure that I'm running my custom actions in the background. I still have my validators that I need for my form. And with that running, I can now run Rasa interactive. And from here, I'm able to show what the effect of this rule is. So here we are in Rasa interactive. I've said hello, and after that, I've indicated that I'm interested in buying a pizza. We can confirm that the simple pizza form is active, and right now the assistant is asking me what size of pizza I might like. So in this case, it's safe to say that we are indeed in the simple pizza form loop. So the condition for the rule is indeed set. So let's see what happens if I ask, by the way, are you a human? Rasa is picking up that indeed the bot challenge intent is active. And if I now say yes, we'll see that Rasa wants to run utter I am a bot as a response, which is indeed what we've configured here. So I can say that's correct. And we can now see that Rasa wants to go back to the simple pizza form. So here we've seen an example where we are indeed able to properly recover. We've just seen an example of an unhappy path that involves an interruption, and it's good to make sure their form is robust against those. But there are also other unhappy paths that we might come across. Let's consider the case where the user no longer wants to fill in the form. How do we then shut it down? Normally, the form would shut down automatically once all the values in the form are filled in. But it might be the case that the user prematurely says, well, I no longer want to buy a pizza. I'm interested in other information from you. The main thing that's different here is that we want to cancel the form before we submit the form. So that means that we might want to have a conversation that looks a little bit like this. After the user tells us that they changed their mind, we have to maybe first check if they're sure, and if they are, then we will drop the form on their behalf. Now note, in this case, it makes a lot of sense from a conversational design perspective to double check if the user is sure that they want to break the form, but given that the user is, we would need to be able to break the form on the user's behalf, even if not everything is filled in yet. To configure this behavior though, we don't configure a rule, instead we configure a stories.yaml file. In this file, you will notice that there is this stop intent being used, after which we ask the user if they're sure that they want to stop. And if they reply with an intent that's either stop or affirm, then we deactivate the loop and the loop is no longer active. Now you might be surprised to learn that we need to use a story here instead of rules. So far, most of the form configuration was using rules, but in this case, it's definitely a story that we need. The reason for this is that rules in Rasa are constrained. You can only have a single step referring to an intent per rule, and this is a mechanism to prevent rules from getting overused. Since we cannot use rules, we will use stories instead, and stories are really a better fit here. We have machine learning tools at our disposal that can look at stories and try to generalize patterns, even when stories become quite elaborate. And that's also the reason why you cannot solve everything with rules. Note though that because we are using stories, it's no longer the rule policy that will be handling the behavior, rather the memoization policy and or the TED policy. Let's see a live demo of this. So let's make sure that we're able to stop a form without having to submit one. What I've done is I have changed my stories.yaml file to have a lot of stories like this one. The most interesting part is this part of the story. Here's where the form gets activated and deactivated. There's a few things that are interesting. There's an interruption happening here in the story, but we have a rule that's covering that. Moreover, what's happening here though is that there's also this intent stop that's being raised. After that, we ask the user to double check if they are sure. And if the user indeed confirms that they are, then we perform the action deactivate loop. After that, there's no more active loop and there's no more slot being requested. It is this action, though, that you probably want to remember. This action will make sure that any loop that's currently active is deactivated. So let's see this in action. Again, I'm inside of Rasa Interactive here, and I'm just at the point where the form started, just like before. Instead of directly answering now, though, what I'm now going to say is stop. I want this form to stop, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to trigger this intent. So indeed, the intent stop has been detected. That's good. Simple pizza form wants to run. And while the form is active, it recognizes that it has to run utter ask continue, which is great. That's something that's picked up on from our story. I can now say yes. Affirm has been detected, which is also good. And now we see that the action deactivate loop is triggering on our behalf, which is exactly what we would like here. Now, one final thing about these stories. A story like this is great because it serves as an example, but you might need more than just one to get the behavior that you like. A rule can be seen as a hard rule, but a story, like this one, is something that is picked up by TED or our memoization policy. So that means that you might need more than one example for either of these policies to properly generalize. In a project that I have here, I don't have just one story, I have a whole bunch with examples. And especially if you're going to be hosting a long form, it can be a good idea to make sure that you've got more than just one example listed here. So far, we've been customizing forms to deal with unhappy paths, and that's totally valid. But you can also wonder, can we maybe do something to prevent unhappy paths and/or something that we can do to enhance the happy path? We could, for example, use buttons to get user feedback instead of having our users type in answers with text. The idea here is that we can make the form also a little bit more dynamic. What we could do is we could say, well, let's introduce an extra question to the form. Maybe somewhere in the beginning of the form, we're going to ask the user, would you like to order a vegetarian pizza? And if that's the case, then the question later in the form that asks for the kind of pizza they're interested in can be also some buttons, but it can be a short list of buttons instead of a long one. The idea here is to demonstrate how you can further customize the form, but I also hope in general that you recognize that thinking about how the user might interact here, buttons might actually make sense as well. It can be a lot faster for the user to click a button on a mobile phone than it is to maybe type the full name of the pizza they're interested in. That means that we will have to create a new form. I'll create a variant of the form that we had earlier, but this form I'll call Fancy Pizza Form. The form will be dynamic, and we'll start by asking the user if they prefer to see a vegetarian option first. Note that in this particular case, the vegetarian slot is Boolean, and that the value is extracted from the text. Again, our form asks by checking if you prefer a vegetarian pizza, but the way that we ask for a vegetarian pizza is also something that we can specify with a custom action. We can have custom code to generate buttons on our behalf, which is what you see in the example here. This custom action will be called by our form thanks to the naming convention, where first we say action underscore ask underscore and then followed by the slot name. It will generate buttons that carry an intent payload, which means that when a user clicks it, we emit a specific intent. The idea is that after a button is clicked, the form validator can kick in, and if the correct intents are detected, we're able to set the slot values appropriately. Given that we've now gotten our slot for vegetarian, we can now use this information again when we ask for the pizza type. If we see the Boolean is true for being vegetarian, then we can send different buttons to the user than if that slot is false. Let's see this in live action by discussing a final demo for this video. We're back at the same Rasa project, but what I've now done is I have added a rule for a new form. I am calling this form the fancy pizza form, mainly to distinguish between the form that we had before. This rule is here to start the form, and this is the rule that will make sure that we submit once the form is done. I have also added the form in my domain.yaml file over here, and you can see that there is a vegetarian slot that's been added. Note that we've also added the slot in the configuration file as well. Now, to handle the form, the main thing that I've done is I've made some big changes to the actions.py file over here. In this file, I have my validator for my fancy pizza form over here, but I also have these two extra custom actions. I have a custom action over here that will ask whether or not you're a vegetarian, and I have another custom action here that will ask what type of pizza you would like to buy. Now, here's what's going to happen when this form is triggered. It's going to start by asking for the vegetarian slot, which in turn means that this function will be triggered, again, because of the naming convention that Rasa uses. I am asking for a vegetarian pizza here, and that is going to generate this message. A question is asked, and there will be two buttons that will be generated. The user in this case can still type a message, but when either of these two buttons are pressed, either the affirm intent will be triggered or the deny intent will be triggered. This information will then be parsed by the form validator. You can see the validator here. The way that this validator works is it's checking the tracker and it's checking the intent of the latest message. And if the intent was affirm, that means that the user prefers a vegetarian pizza. We then send back a message to the user confirming this, and we can set the vegetarian slot to be equal to true. We can do the same thing when we see a deny, but then we will not set it to true. Instead, we'll set it to false. And if we got neither affirm or deny, then we can just invalidate the information and tell the user that we didn't get what they were trying to tell us. The form will then ask the user again if they'd be interested in a vegetarian pizza or not. At this point in time, we can assume that the vegetarian slot is set. And that means that later in the form, when it's time to start asking about the pizza type, we can use the information that is in this slot. And that's exactly what we're doing here. When we're asking for the pizza type, the tracker is consulted and we're getting the vegetarian slot out. If we know for certain that the user is interested in a vegetarian pizza, then we are going to be generating buttons, but the buttons will only carry the payload from the vegetarian pizza list. And if the user doesn't want to have a vegetarian pizza, then we are going to fetch it from the meat pizza list. Having explained how this form works, let's now interact with it so we can see what the user might experience. I'm inside of my terminal window. I've got the Rasa action service running in a separate terminal, and I'm running Rasa Interactive, and I'm at the point where I'm about to trigger the new fancy form. I will copy an example that I had in my NLU training data by saying I want to buy a fancy pizza. We can see that the correct intent is triggered, which is good, which means that a rule will now activate and trigger the fancy pizza form. We can also see that the interface is a little bit different now. We can use our arrows to indicate the correct answer, and it seems like there are two buttons that we can press, but we are also still able to type out our own message if we wanted to. I'll go ahead and hit yes here. And what that's going to do is it's going to send this text into the terminal. In Rasa, if you start with a backslash, you can indicate a specific command. And in this case, we are triggering a specific intent by adding the backslash first. So what just happened is that the custom action ran, it's picked up that we prefer vegetarian, and we can also see that the vegetarian slot has been set. Next up, we're going to ask for the pizza size. So I'll just type large here. In this case, the entity is detected on our behalf, which is great. And we're moving on with the form. So now we're going to be asking about the kind of pizza the user might want to buy. And in this case, we have a custom action that is using this slot to generate this question, but also it's generating these buttons on our behalf. So from here, I'm able to select the kind of pizza that I like. I'll go for veggie now, but effectively what will happen is when I hit this button, this text will be sent into the terminal below. We can now see that the pizza size slot has been set, the pizza type slot has been set, and the vegetarian type has been set, which means that the form can now submit. And there you have it. We're using slots set before to generate questions that we'll be able to use later, and it's also a little bit more dynamic now. A quick thing before we wrap up. I just showed you the form inside of a terminal, and Rasa Interactive is great, but it doesn't really show you what the buttons might be like. So that's why I wanted to show what this looks like inside of Rasa X, just as a quick preview. We'll get to Rasa X in detail in a later video, but one thing I do want to highlight is that this gives you a better experience of what the buttons might be like if you're a user. Inside of Rasa X, these buttons will actually go ahead and render, and you can see all the separate steps and all the events that are happening in between. But what's nice about the Rasa X environment is that we are actually seeing the buttons being rendered here, which is nice. Note that not every endpoint for Rasa can generate these buttons for you. For example, I believe that WhatsApp doesn't allow you to render these buttons, but if you're building a virtual assistant for a web endpoint, having Rasa X can also be nice because it gives you just a little bit of a user interface element to explore. So let's wrap up. Forms in Rasa are very flexible. Not only can you escape unhappy paths, you're also able to customize it to make it easier for your end users to give you the information that you need. As a final piece of advice though, try to keep forms simple, especially in the beginning. Before you fully customize your own form, it makes sense to wait until you've got some feedback from actual end users. It's usually a lot easier to customize your form once you understand how your users prefer to interact with it.